Director and co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on.
We are asking the question of whether or not universal basic income would work in the UK. I guess it would be prudent for some listeners who may have no idea what universal basic income is, for you to just explain it to us. I have to admit, for me, it was a concept I was completely unfamiliar with until I heard it discussed on a podcast. And I'll have to say off the bat, and I'll put my cards on the table, I thought it sounded like a great idea. But I know that there is a lot of skepticism around it as well. So let's kick off by you telling us what the proposal is. What is universal basic income?
Well, it's an idea, and it is the idea that you would give everyone in society a regular cash payment forever. And it really is as simple as that. We already have a basic income for most children and most pensioners in the form of a child benefit and the state pension. And this is the idea of expanding that to every single person in society, regardless of their income, regardless of their background. And it's really based on the idea that everyone has the right to a secure income, particularly when so many of us are experiencing insecurity in some way. So that's why we set up the Basic Income Conversation, which launches tomorrow with a new website, so that we can start having that conversation up and down the country about what it might mean for people.
So this is the campaign group, the Basic Income Conversation. You've got your website launching tomorrow. And to start the conversation, hopefully, I assume lobby a government, whichever one is there at the time for lobbying, to put this into effect. Now, before we come, because there have been places which have tried universal basic income. Before we come to that, I feel we need to explain a little bit more.
For sure.
Because there are certain key differences. Am I right in thinking that universal basic income, before we get to the amounts, because that's where people start sort of having difficulties, am I right in saying that this goes to every single every single citizen of the country, regardless of age, gender, etc. And it also, quite importantly, continues if you are in employment.
Yes, that's correct.
So whether you have a job or not, this is unlike benefits, where if you're working, then you're not entitled to certain benefits. And also, well, am I right in thinking that it replaces benefits? So you'd get universal basic income, but you would not then qualify for housing benefits or extra benefits?
Yes, so you're broadly correct. So the idea, how it would work in practice is that everyone would receive your cash in your bank account, probably either every week or every month, and you are free to spend that however you like. There's no strings attached, there's no terms and conditions. You're right, it would replace much of our welfare system, but crucially for those who are most in need, for example, if you have a disability or you're a parent with children, you would have additional support and it wouldn't sort of suddenly replace everything in our welfare system. But yes, it would go to every single person individually, not to the household, which is crucial. It would be free for you to spend as you wish.
And it would also, and again, I just want to get this through for people who are unfamiliar with the concept of universal basic income. You would qualify for it even if you were a multimillionaire who owns multiple houses, multiple businesses, a billionaire. You would still get that money from the government.
You would, and it's important that those get that too, because we are all part of the same society. We are all contributing in one form or another. And many of us, however rich you are, up and down the income scale, may fall on hard times at certain points. Increasingly so, I think, with the economy and society.
James Dyson will ever sort of be in need of a universal basic
and I think
income.
for those individuals, the very wealthiest in society, even though they would get a basic income, in the way that you would pay for it would most likely be a tax on the very wealthiest, like James Dyson. And so he would, in effect, whilst he would get it, he would pay much more into the system.
Right. And of course, he would have the option of declining it.
And he would, or he could give it to charity. He could do whatever he likes to it. But I think it is important that some of the most popular parts of our social security system are the ones that are universal, like the NHS, like our schools, because we are all part of the society. And I think that at times there's been an othering process and a stigma attached to receiving benefits. And actually, we are all deserving of that as part of a society.
We spoke about that in our earlier hour with universal credit. I believe that quite a lot of the reason why we're seeing a 6% rise in psychological difficulties for recipients of universal credit is the attitude towards every single claimant of universal credit being stigmatized. That somehow, are they really deserving of it? And are they pilfering money off the system? So yes, you're right that this would get rid of that. Just quickly, Michael is going to be here with me for quite some time longer. If you have any questions about universal basic income, if you disagree, now's your chance. 0344 499 1000 is the number you need. Give us a call and you can have a chat with me and Michael, or tweet us your question at TALKRadio. Michael, here are some of the questions that I certainly had when I first heard of this idea, because initially it's great, and we can move on to talk about the benefits of it. But let's deal with some of the questions that people immediately have, the reaction, which is, well, what's to stop someone of using up all that money? So let's say you're not talking about a wealthy individual, but you're talking about someone who would otherwise be in receipt of certain benefits. Now they get the UBI, the universal basic income. They spend it all on, I don't know, a holiday, or someone tweeted here, oh, great, the government's going to be giving me beer money. Fantastic. And then they still don't have enough money for basic needs like clothes, food, and shelter. Then what happens?
Well, first of all, I would say all of the evidence so far from all of the pilots and experiments that have taken place around the world has proven that most people spend it on feeding their children, perhaps going into education, training for a new job. The idea that somehow everyone would go out and waste this money on things is somewhat of a myth. And actually, the evidence shows that we need to broaden the conception of what it means to contribute to society. One of the questions we often get is, would people suddenly stop working, or would they be lazy? Actually, we have, if some of your listeners are at home caring for a child today as a parent, or looking after an elderly relative, those are some of the most important jobs in our society, and the hardest ones, yet they're currently valued at zero in our economy. And so the idea of basic income would expand the conception of what work is, what it means to contribute to society.
They are part of the economically inactive, as Home Secretary Priti Patel said. There's 8.5 million people available to work. True figure is just under 2 million, because most of those people are students. A lot of them are carers and unable to work. You touched upon one of the benefits, one of the big benefits, I think, that universal basic income has. It's quite difficult to explain, but I'm going to try, and maybe you can correct me if I've got the wrong end of the stick. But I think the big difference it could make, and actually somebody touched upon it, said, oh, great, I could quit my current job and go and do what I really like, which is, here we go, Remain a Bot says, it would work for me, stuff my crappy job. I want to be free to design computer games. And for me, it does have that benefit of people who are doing jobs, and the government's very, very happy to tell us how we've got record low unemployment. They also forget to tell us that we've got record high in-work poverty. You would instantly you would taking millions of children out of poverty, and millions of adults who are in work out of poverty, which is that's immediately done. But also you would give people the opportunity to, and I don't want to belittle it, but to be happier in what they're doing.
Yes.
So if you have, a lot of people out there listening to this will be doing jobs they don't really want to do, but they have to do them because they have to put food on the table, clothe their kids or themselves, and put shelter. Once you have the security of knowing that you're not going to go poor or hungry, then you're able to perhaps use that time with an extra job, perhaps to train for a job that you really want to do, to give you that leeway, basically not being threatened with poverty. in order to survive.
Yeah.
Have I got this right, or am
That's
I missing
correct.
something?
That's correct. Again, we can point to the evidence of many of the experiments and the pilots where people, rather than sort of suddenly quitting their job and doing nothing, actually they've wanted to retrain, find a new skill. They may not fully like the job that they're in, but they want to be trying something else. And this gives them the security to be able to go away and do that. The other thing that I hear very often when we ask the question, what would you do with a basic income, is that so many people have an idea for a small business and are naturally entrepreneurial, but never really have the chance to do that. And really, I think what economic security gives you is the chance to take risks. And not only be seen as this to be seen as an income floor or a safety net that people can fall below, but actually be a springboard for people to aspire to the things that they want to do. And that's partly why we set up the basic income conversation. I'm always excited to hear people when they say, well, what would you do with a basic income? And very often it is these different forms of work.
Now, let's tackle, before we come to the pilots, because you've mentioned them a few times, and basic income has been piloted, I think, in Finland, if I'm correct. But it hasn't really been implemented by any country.
That's right.
If I'm correct. So we'll come to the reasons why about that after the break. But before that, I'm sure some people will be screaming at the radio of, how much are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Are we talking about, 20 quid a week, or are we talking about 100 quid a week? It's the amount seems to be quite an important one.
Definitely. And there are a range of proposals out there made by think tanks and academics that have written different economic models on that. Most of the credible examples out there range somewhere between £50 and £100 a week, which for many might not sound like a huge amount of money, but the studies show that, as you mentioned earlier, we could almost eradicate poverty straight away. And it would be a huge investment into local communities and revive our high streets and particularly those that have suffered most from austerity.
But that's a lot of money. You are talking just off the back of a sort of quick calculation. I've put in 65 million. I know we're sort of just above that. At the lowest estimate of 50 quid a week, that's 3.2 billion pounds. That's a lot of money.
It is a lot of money, but one of the things that we rarely factor in when thinking about the cost is the cost of not doing it. So currently we spend an awful lot of money on our health services, on tackling homelessness, on criminal justice. And all of the evidence suggests that when you give people economic security in the form of a basic income, people get healthier. We reduce poverty, we reduce crime, we reduce homelessness. And that can save us an awful lot of money. The other thing to factor in is the boost that it would give to the economy. As I said, people would most likely spend it locally in their local communities. It would create jobs. People would want to start their own businesses. There are a number of studies out there that show it can actually be an increase in GDP. So I would urge people not to sort of do the back of a napkin calculations of simply sort of timesing the amount of people by the number, because it's a little bit more complicated than that, as I'm sure you know.
I agree. I agree with what you're saying, that you have to look past that, but you also have to agree with me that you're going to get a lot of resistance to this idea, and people will ask you, well, how are you going to pay for it?
Yeah.
How are you going to, that I gave you the 3.2 billion as the £50 estimate. If we took the £100 estimate, of course, it will be 6.4 billion. And it is correct for people to go, okay, sounds like a great idea. How do you pay for it? Where does the money come
absolutely.
from?
It's a really important question.
And if you add to that some people may not, for example, may take the £100 a week and then decide, well, actually, I don't need much. I don't need to get a part-time job. Therefore, they're not paying national insurance. They're not doing tax contributions. So you may also lose money contributed to the Treasury, because you may be lifting people out of the necessity to get a job and pay taxes.
Sure. Well, first of all, I mean, obviously it's a question that we've thought of, and there are a number of studies and models out there that have come up with ways of paying for this. If we've got time to broadly summarize both kind of two schools of thought. One is that you would implement progressive taxation to ensure the wealthiest in society pay their fair share. So that's how you get a system where the richest person might be, yes, getting a basic income, but paying a lot more in tax. There's the other idea of evenly distributing things that we all have a fair share in. So things like carbon taxes, data dividends, taxing some of the biggest companies like Amazon, or sharing the profits of our publicly owned goods. So, for example, Alaska in the United States has a basic income based on the oil reserves that they give out. So there are ways of paying for it. And a lot of the studies out there have actually found that when you factor everything in, it ends up as being about revenue neutral. So it doesn't. There are studies that say actually this isn't going to cost us any more than what the current system does.
We're going to take a break there. There's questions flooding in, which I will put to you after the break. 0344 499 1000 is the number you need, or you could tweet us here at Talk Radio. Michael will continue being with me in the studio, and we will continue our conversation on universal basic income.
Talk Radio. Alexis Conran on Talk Radio with the
Welcome back to the last part of the show with me, Alexis Conran, here on Talk Radio, powered by The Times. Know your times. With me, my studio guest at the moment is Michael Pugh. He's the director and co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. It's a lobby group pushing for the adoption of universal basic income, which we've been describing. Their website launches tomorrow. Where can people find the website, Michael?
It's simply basicincomeconversation.org.
There we go. We've done that bit. We'll remind me to do it at the end.
We'll do a plug at the end.
But here's quite a few questions coming in for you. Questions which I'd planned to ask, but I'm going to let my listeners do that. So we have on YouTube, Kat says, how long would it take to introduce it?
Well, it would. First of all, we need to persuade the decision maker to do it,
Yes.
which is partly where the basic income conversation comes in.
Bearing in mind, we've seen universal credit take, 7 years and it's still not fully rolled out.
Yes. It would take, for example, there was a recent person running for president in the United States called Andrew Yang. He committed to introduce the basic income within a year. In some ways, it's a much simpler argument as, say, something like universal credit, which is, a whole range of different benefits being put together. This is a very simple idea, really, of just giving every single person the same amount of money. So it wouldn't be as complex as other systems to roll out.
Next one, Kevin on Twitter, and I think this is the question that quite a lot of people are skeptical about, is has it worked anywhere else? Because it sort of sounds like a very attractive idea to some people, but then you start thinking, well, hang on a minute. It's not a new idea. It's quite an old concept. Well, how come no one's actually put it into practice?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's firstly important to tell your listeners that nowhere has tried a universal basic income in the way that we are talking about. So we do rely on the sort of the pilots and the experiments that have taken place around the world, which there are many. So in sort of Canada, the United States, Finland, the Netherlands, India, Kenya, and many more. And I was really lucky to be able to visit two of those places last summer, and which are two examples that are fresh in my mind. One of them is Canada, where they trialled it both in the 1970s and more recently in Ontario. It had a huge impact on health, for example. Mm-hmm. So actually A&E admissions went down by about 8% in the areas in which they had basic income, which is quite striking when you consider that impact on people's health.
Certainly the NHS could do with an 8% reduction.
When you speak to any sort of NHS professionals and say you can find an 8 to 9% reduction in your costs, they would bite your hand off for something like that. The other experiences, though, was the voices of people that I met who had experienced basic income, particularly in Ontario. They said that they had, some of them had started their own businesses. The local high street was thriving again. people were spending more time with their families, eating healthier food. And one of the interesting things that kept coming up was the phrase that I feel human again. And I know was listening to your show earlier about the conversation of universal credit and this kind of lack of dignity that we have. When we provide people with security and trust people, it has a huge impact on a positive impact on our mental health. The other place that I visited, which is kind of midway through their pilot at the moment, is Stockton, California, which is giving about 125 people $500 a month as part of a trial. And the phrase that was used, kind of that kept coming up when researchers were speaking to the participants, was "I can breathe. I can breathe again." And I think that's what that suggests, is that we are somehow strangling people in a way, and that basic income can breathe new life into our communities.
It's funny you touched upon something earlier, which again, it's one of those sort of conflicts that you spot over and over again because of the partisanship of politics now, where people are sort of either on one side or on the other. But it's funny, and looking at the Twitter feed, you can basically tell from the Twitter profiles of people where they stand politically. And the biggest pushback has been from quite right-wing accounts, Brexit-supporting accounts. And it's quite interesting that it's the same accounts that don't like any sort of idea of a nanny state. But it's the same accounts sort of getting themselves into awful mental contortions right now, where they go, well, I don't want to give money to people who are just going to spend it on drink and drugs and, waste it. So on that side, they believe that the nanny state should tell you what you should spend your money on. But if it comes to UBI, like, I don't like that. We don't want people making their own decisions. I really need to go and think in a quiet room before posting all this nonsense. I
agree. I think one of the values that cuts across the political divide when we talk about basic income is this idea of freedom. Actually, people don't like being told what they can and can't spend it on. And
you'd think that people against a nanny state who want all about free market and the people, we want less government, not more government, they'd love UBI. But no, someone's told them they need to hate it.
Well, there definitely is a conservative argument for basic income. Another one of the pilots was in Finland, which was actually a conservative government that introduced that pilot. There, again, they found similar results around mental health being improved, and they couldn't find any impact on work, which was one of the common fears that people have around it. So I think there's definitely, there's a frustration out there amongst the country about how we've ended up in this sort of left, right, good, bad kind of politics that's so divisive. And I think basic income is one of those ideas that can cut across that and move us forward, actually, into sort of ideas of the 21st century.
But it is important to say that there have been all these studies, and you spoke very positively about all these studies. However, as a result of all these studies, no governments have chosen to put universal basic income into action. Why?
It's a good question. There's no hiding that we are talking about a really big change. And at key junctures over points in our history, governments have decided to follow a different path when it comes to our social security system. We are talking about a shift in the way we think socially and politically, and that requires a big shift in thinking. And I think up until this point, the basic income argument has often been made by pilots and academic papers, and we haven't really started to have that argument and conversation with the wider public. And that's why we set up this organisation, so that we can start to build the movement, start to base this
answering
argument.
the questions as well.
Yeah, and rather than sort of saying, no, this is the silver bullet and this is going to change everyone's life, start to have that dialogue with people so that we can take people with us.
Another question from Foxabillo, I don't know what the name is, on YouTube, says, and this is an interesting one, what's to stop prices going up to absorb the UBI? So you're potentially giving £5,200 per person in the UK. Businesses are going, well, hang on a minute, there's all that extra cash sloshing around in the economy. We're just going to put our prices up a little bit to get hold of that cash?
Yeah, it's a good question. People often ask it. I think there's two answers to it. Three. There's no evidence to suggest that would be inflationary. The reasons for that is that there are the usual pressures in our economy that keep inflation low. So competition for prices and things. And in an economy with basic income, that competition amongst businesses and landlords, etc., would be even greater. And we're also not printing any new money. This is the same money just being shifted around the economy in a different way.
Good point. Last question here from Tristan on YouTube said, would it not be fairer? He's put that in quotes. I don't understand why. Fairer, okay. Would it not be fairer to offer certain help? Food, water, electric vouchers. Surely hard cash could be spent on harmful things.
Well, I think it goes back to that conversation around trusting people.
Nanny state.
Yeah. And I've been a community organizer for a number of years and worked with communities on the ground who are thinking about the challenges that they face. And very often it's not some sort of service that they need from the government. People just lack cash. And I think we should trust people to spend it as they wish. And I think when we have the conversation and we ask people, how would you spend it? So often it's positive reasons. And I think we should ask ourselves, if we think we're going to spend it in a positive way, why do we think other people are going to somehow waste this? I think that's something that we've taught ourselves, sadly, in our society, where we don't trust others.
So the website launches tomorrow, basicincomeconversation.org. What are the next steps? How do you start the process of rolling this out into public consciousness and getting people talking about it?
Yeah, well, firstly, it's really exciting because we're not starting from scratch. There's already a lot of energy behind the idea. There are a number of groups that have set up right across the country. You might have seen recently 3 local authorities, Liverpool, Sheffield, Hull, have all joined the call for expressing an interest in piloting it here in the UK. Scotland, the Scottish Government introduced a feasibility study to look into what pilots would look like. We are expecting that report to land in the summer, in which we are expecting it to recommend a pilot. So we are looking to build on some of that energy. We're asking people to join the conversation on the website tomorrow. What they'll receive from us is some training and support and toolkits about how to have this conversation at home. So whether it's around the dinner table with friends and family, whether it's down the pub or in the school playground, hosting your own event in the local community or attending one, whichever you feel comfortable with, we'll be able to support you with. And we'll be, over the course of the next year, hearing some of those stories, listening to them, and forming that into a narrative that we think can start to move the conversation along on a political sense, and kind of join it up with some of the existing research that is out there. We're going to have a research network that will be building the credibility of the argument, as well as working with our cross-party network of supporters in Parliament and local authorities around the country.
Do you have supporters in Parliament? I know the Green Party, it was in their manifesto, but have you got support in Parliament, cross-party support?
There is cross-party support for it. For example, in Hull, it was the Liberal Democrats that promoted the idea, and they've Ed Davey, who's running for leadership of the Lib Dems, has been a public supporter of it. Labour had it in their manifesto in the form of pilots, which had support from the likes of John McDonnell, but also Ed Miliband. We've got a summit of activists coming together on the next Saturday, where Olivia Blake, the newly elected MP for Sheffield, is joining us. And of course, as I mentioned just before, the Scottish Government, the SNP, have expressed interest in the idea. So there is a growing cross-party support for the idea, and we hope to work with those over the course of the coming Parliament to make the case even further.
Well, I look forward to the conversation starting. I think it's an interesting idea, and I do love discussing it, and I do love hearing people discussing, because I think there's a lot to talk about. So, Michael, thank you for giving us your time. Michael Pugh there, Director and Co-founder of Basic Income Conversation. The website goes live tomorrow, Monday, basicincomeconversation.org. We'll be straight back after this.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker.